They say life can change in an instant, but for me, it felt like it took one signature. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I closed the deal that would change everything. After months of grueling late nights, endless video calls, and countless emails, I'd secured the contract that had been haunting my thoughts for nearly a year. My company's biggest client had signed on the dotted line, and my role as the lead negotiator didn't go unnoticed. There were handshakes, pats on the back, and promises of a fat bonus. I walked into the house that evening feeling 10 feet tall, ready to share the good news with Candy, my wife of 7 years. Candy was my anchor. Her steady support had always grounded me during tough times. I called out to her as I dropped my keys on the counter, expecting her usual warm greeting. Instead, I was met with silence. I found her in the living room, scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. "Hey," I said, my voice filled with excitement. "You'll never guess what happened today." She glanced up, offering a half-hearted smile before returning her focus to her phone. "That's great, Tim," she said, her tone flat, devoid of the enthusiasm I'd expected. I paused, the wind knocked out of my sails. Candy was usually my biggest cheerleader, but tonight she seemed distant. I told myself she was probably tired. Work had been demanding for her lately, especially after her company launched a new project. Her boss, Jake, had been leaning heavily on her, and she'd recently taken a business trip with him to Chicago. It wasn't unusual for Candy to travel for work, but something about this trip had been different. She came back quieter, more withdrawn. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion, but as the days turned into weeks, her mood didn't improve. She wasn't just tired, she was disconnected. The change was subtle at first. She'd spend more time on her phone, her face lighting up with expressions I hadn't seen in a while. Soft smiles, quiet chuckles, but they weren't directed at me. Conversations became shorter. Dinners, once filled with laughter and stories about our days, grew quiet. When I asked about her trip, she'd brush it off, saying, "It was fine, nothing exciting." But her eyes told a different story, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. One night, I woke up to find her side of the bed empty. Groggy, I stumbled out of the bedroom and found her sitting on the couch, her phone in hand. She jumped when she saw me, quickly locking the screen. "Couldn't sleep," she said, forcing a smile. I nodded, though unease crept into my chest. It wasn't like her to be up so late. I tried to focus on my own successes, throwing myself into work and enjoying the accolades from my colleagues. But at home, I couldn't ignore the growing gap between us. Candy was slipping away, and I didn't know why. The warmth in her voice, the light in her eyes, they were still there, but they no longer seemed meant for me. I began to wonder if the trip with Jake had more to do with it than she was letting on. Jake had always been friendly enough. I'd met him at a few company events, and while he seemed charming, there was an edge to him, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Candy often spoke highly of him, praising his leadership and work ethic. "Jake's just got this way of making things happen," she once said, her eyes lighting up as she described a project they'd completed together. I hadn't thought much of it then, but now, the memory lingered in my mind like an unwelcome guest. One evening, I decided to surprise Candy with a night out, hoping to rekindle some of the spark we'd lost. I picked up her favorite flowers and made reservations at the restaurant where we'd had our first date. When I told her the plan, she hesitated. "That sounds nice," she said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "But I've got a lot on my plate right now. Maybe another time." Her rejection stung more than I cared to admit. I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment, and retreated to the bedroom. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind raced with questions. Was it me? Was I not enough anymore? Or was there something, or someone else pulling her away? I began to notice other things. Candy's wardrobe had changed subtly. Sleeker dresses, higher heels, a new shade of lipstick I'd never seen before. She was taking more care with her appearance, even on days she claimed to be working from home. When I mentioned it, she laughed it off. "It's just nice to feel put together," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. But the explanation felt hollow. The doubts that had been whispering at the edges of my mind began to grow louder. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking things. Candy and I had always trusted each other, and I didn't want to jeopardize that by jumping to conclusions. But the more I tried to dismiss my fears, the harder they became to ignore. The tipping point came one Friday evening. I came home early, eager to surprise her, only to find the house empty. A note on the counter read, "Out with friends. Don't wait up." It wasn't unusual for Candy to have a girls' night, but something about it felt off. Her friends usually texted me selfies from their outings, tagging me in their stories, but that night my phone stayed silent. I sat on the couch, staring at the note, my chest tight with a mix of confusion and unease. As much as I wanted to believe everything was fine, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers. Candy was changing, and I didn't know how to stop it, or if I even could. The morning after Candy's night out, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my chest. She had come home late, slipping into bed without a word. When I asked how her night was, she mumbled something about it being fine, before rolling over and drifting off to sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her growing distance. The next day, while Candy was in the shower, I noticed her bag sitting on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't even consider going through her things, but the doubts that had been swirling in my mind for weeks refused to be silenced. It wasn't about distrust, or at least that's what I told myself. It was about understanding what had gone so wrong between us. I unzipped her bag carefully, my hands trembling slightly. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Her wallet, a pack of gum, a small bottle of perfume. Then I saw it. A receipt from a restaurant I didn't recognize, tucked inside a side pocket. My heart sank as I examined the details. It was for dinner for two at a high-end spot downtown, dated 2 nights ago. Candy hadn't mentioned going out for dinner, and I certainly hadn't been with her. My chest tightened as I flipped the receipt over, hoping for some kind of explanation. But there was nothing, just the stark confirmation that Candy had been somewhere with someone and hadn't told me about it. The second item was even more unsettling. A small, folded note. It wasn't signed, but the message was clear. Had a great time last night. Can't wait to see you again.
Zizek.
It had to be him. I felt the air leave my lungs as I stared at the note. A storm of emotions crashed over me. Hurt, anger, disbelief. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the evidence was hard to ignore. Candy had been pulling away for weeks, and now it seemed like I had stumbled upon the reason why. That evening, I tried to act normal. Candy went about her routine, oblivious to the turmoil brewing inside me. I wanted to confront her then and there, to shove the receipt and note in her face and demand an explanation. But something held me back. I needed more than circumstantial evidence. I needed the truth. The next morning, after Candy left for work, I made a call. "Mike, it's Tim," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Mike was an old friend, a private investigator by trade. We'd lost touch over the years, but I remembered his reputation for being thorough and discreet. If anyone could help me get to the bottom of this, it was him. "Tim, long time no talk," he said, his voice warm but professional. "What's going on?" I hesitated for a moment before diving in. "I think Candy might be cheating on me. I need your help to find out for sure." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Mike said, "Okay, tell me everything." I explained the changes in Candy's behavior, the business trip with Jake, the note, and the receipt. Mike listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he let out a low whistle. "You've got enough to be suspicious, that's for sure. But if you want proof, we're gonna have to do this carefully. No confrontations yet. Let me handle it." Mike suggested setting up surveillance on Candy. Nothing invasive, just enough to monitor her movements and interactions. He assured me that discretion was his top priority and promised to provide updates as soon as he had anything concrete. The first few days of surveillance were uneventful. Candy's routine seemed normal: work, errands, and the occasional dinner with friends. But then, on a Thursday afternoon, Mike called me with an update. "Tim, she left the office early today," he said. "Met someone at a coffee shop downtown. Tim, Jake." They sat in a corner booth, talking and laughing. Nothing overly suspicious yet, but the body language, it's intimate. My stomach twisted at his words. "Did they leave together?" I asked. "No," Mike said. "They left separately, but it's clear there's something there. I'll keep digging." Over the next week, Mike's reports painted a picture I didn't want to see. Candy and Jake met frequently, always in discreet locations, coffee shops, a park, even a hotel lobby. They were careful not to draw attention, but their chemistry was undeniable. The final blow came on a Saturday evening. Candy had told me she was meeting friends for drinks, but Mike's surveillance told a different story. She and Jake had dinner at a small, upscale bistro on the outskirts of town. Mike managed to snap a few photos. The two of them sitting close, Jake's hand brushing hers across the table, their laughter captured mid-conversation. When Candy came home that night, she acted as if everything was fine. She kissed me on the cheek, her smile warm but distant. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I held my tongue. I needed more time to process everything, to decide my next move. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a cold clarity settled over me. Candy was lying to me, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening between her and Jake, it was real. And now, with the evidence piling up, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. A week later, I sat in my office, staring blankly at my computer screen. My coffee had gone cold, untouched, as the weight of what I'd learned settled over me. Mike had just sent me an email with the subject line, "Candy, full report." I hesitated before opening it, my hand trembling slightly as I moved the mouse. Part of me didn't want to see what lay inside. Ignorance, as painful as it was, still felt safer than the truth. But the other part of me, the part that demanded answers, clicked the email. The report was thorough, complete with timestamps, photos, and detailed observations. At first, it simply confirmed what I already suspected. Candy was seeing Jake. Their dinners, coffee dates, and whispered conversations were all cataloged in excruciating detail. There were photos of them laughing, leaning close, his hand resting on her back in a way that made my stomach churn. But as I read further, the betrayal deepened. It wasn't just Jake. Mike's investigation had uncovered something I never would have imagined. Candy had also been involved with Jake's son, Ryan, a young man fresh out of college, interning at their company. There were pictures of them together, too. Meeting at a hotel, holding hands as they walked through the lobby. Candy's face lit up with a smile I hadn't seen in years. The timestamps showed that these encounters had started months ago, overlapping with her meetings with Jake. I felt sick. The woman I had loved, trusted, and built a life with wasn't just cheating. She was living a double life, weaving lies so intricate I wondered if I had ever truly known her. I scrolled further, finding more evidence. Receipts for hotel stays, text conversations recovered from her phone, and even a recorded phone call between Candy and Jake. The call was brief, but the words were clear. "You think Tim suspects anything?" Jake had asked. "Not a chance," Candy replied, laughing softly. "He's too wrapped up in his work to notice. Honestly, it's perfect. Perfect." That word echoed in my head, sharp and cutting. To her, I was nothing more than a convenient blind spot. A fool too preoccupied to see what was right in front of him. As I finished reading the report, my anger gave way to cold resolve. There was no saving this marriage, no room for forgiveness. Candy hadn't just betrayed me. She had made a mockery of everything we'd built together. I called Mike. "I've seen enough," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Thank you for your work. I'll handle it from here." Mike offered his condolences, but I barely heard him. My mind was already racing with the next steps. The following morning, I contacted a divorce attorney. The process was more straightforward than I expected, thanks to the mountain of evidence Mike had provided. The lawyer assured me that Candy's infidelities would leave her with little leverage, and I'd be in a strong position to move forward. That evening, I sat down with a bottle of whiskey, staring at the divorce papers spread across the dining table. Candy was out again, claiming she had a work meeting, and I knew exactly where she was. When she came home later that night, I was waiting for her. "Hey," she said, her voice cheerful but distant. "You're up late." I nodded, gesturing for her to sit down. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered as she took a seat across from me. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said bluntly. "It's not." I slid the folder across the table, watching as she opened it. Her eyes widened as she scanned the documents inside. The photos, the receipts, the text logs. "Tim," she started, her voice trembling. "I can explain." "Don't," I interrupted, my tone cold. "I don't want to hear it. This," I gestured to the folder, "tells me everything I need to know." Her expression shifted from panic to defiance. "You went through my private life? That's a violation. Don't even try to turn this around on me." I snapped, my voice rising. "You lied to me. You cheated on me. You made a fool out of me, Candy. And now you're going to sit here and talk about violations." She fell silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "I've already filed for divorce. The papers are here. You'll need to sign them by the end of the week." Candy's face paled. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," I said, standing up. "This is over, Candy. I can't do this anymore." She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. "Tim, don't," I said, cutting her off. "Whatever you have to say, it doesn't matter anymore." The next few days were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and quiet moments of reflection. I thought about the years I'd spent with Candy, the memories we'd shared, the dreams we'd built together. It hurt to let it all go, but I knew there was no other way. One final decision loomed over me: Jake. As much as I wanted to confront him, to make him pay for his part in this betrayal, I decided against it. He wasn't worth my energy. Cutting ties with Candy, and by extension Jake, was the cleanest way to move forward. When the divorce papers were finalized, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. My life had been torn apart, but for the first time in months, I felt free. Candy's lies had poisoned our marriage, but they wouldn't define my future. I was determined to rebuild piece by piece and leave her and the pain she caused behind. Life after Candy was both unfamiliar and strangely liberating. In the first few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I was a wreck. The house felt hollow without her presence, even though that same presence had grown cold long before she left. The memories we'd built together lingered like ghosts, reminding me of the betrayal at every turn. I avoided our favorite spots in town and even switched grocery stores, anything to escape the shadows of my old life. One night, after staring at my half-packed boxes for hours, I decided something had to change. I couldn't let my past define me. I had to move forward, no matter how daunting it felt. The first step was therapy. I had always been the type to bottle things up, convincing myself that time alone would heal all wounds. But this was different. The betrayal had cut so deep that I didn't trust my own thoughts anymore. My therapist, Dr. Nolan, was a calm, grounded man in his 40s who listened intently without judgment. During our first session, he let me rant about everything: Candy, Jake, and the mess of emotions I couldn't untangle. "You've been through a profound betrayal, Tim," he said after I finished. "But the fact that you're here shows strength. Healing will take time, but it's possible. We'll take it one step at a time." Those words, simple as they were, struck a chord. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a roadmap, however hazy. Outside of therapy, I threw myself into rebuilding my career. The tension with Jake had made staying at my old company unbearable, so I'd quietly started job hunting even before the divorce was finalized. After a few promising interviews, I landed a position with a new firm, one that valued my experience and offered a fresh start. The work was challenging but fulfilling, and the team was a breath of fresh air. I found myself staying late, not out of necessity, but because I was genuinely excited about the projects I was working on. My boss, Elena, was sharp and supportive, and she reminded me of what it felt like to work in a healthy environment. Still, the legal battle against Jake loomed in the background. My attorney had advised me to pursue an alienation of affection case, a little-known law that allowed a spouse to sue a third party for interfering in their marriage. At first, I wasn't sure if it was worth the effort, but as I looked at the evidence Mike had gathered, I realized I couldn't let Jake walk away unscathed. He'd manipulated Candy, betrayed my trust, and flaunted his actions without a hint of remorse. The case was grueling, dragging on for months. Jake's attorneys tried every trick in the book to dismiss the claim, painting me as a bitter ex-husband seeking revenge. But the evidence was undeniable. The text messages, the surveillance photos, and the receipts all pointed to his role in the destruction of my marriage. When the verdict finally came in, I was sitting in the courtroom, my hands clenched tightly on the table. The judge's voice was firm but clear. Jake was found liable, and the court awarded me $1 million in damages. The room seemed to exhale as the decision was announced. Jake sat stone-faced, his lawyers whispering frantically in his ear. I didn't gloat. I didn't even look at him as I walked out of the courtroom. The money wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. With the settlement in hand, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I used part of the money to pay off the remaining balance on the house, freeing myself from the weight of financial strain. The rest I set aside for investments, therapy, and a long-overdue vacation. Dr. Nolan encouraged me to celebrate the small victories, so I did. I started taking care of myself in ways I hadn't before. Hitting the gym, trying new recipes, even picking up painting, something I hadn't done since college. And then there was the trip. I booked a 2-week stay in the mountains, a cabin surrounded by pine trees and endless trails. It was everything I needed: solitude, nature, and time to reflect. I spent my mornings hiking, the crisp air filling my lungs as I pushed myself to reach new peaks. In the evenings, I'd sit by the fireplace, sketching or journaling about the things I was grateful for. By the time I returned home, I felt lighter, stronger. The pain of Candy's betrayal still lingered, but it no longer consumed me. I was building something new, piece by piece, and for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful about the future. One day, while sorting through old files, I found a picture of Candy and me from our honeymoon. I stared at it for a long moment before slipping it into a drawer. That chapter of my life was over, and I was finally okay with that. As I stood in my kitchen, sipping coffee and watching the morning light filter through the window, I realized something profound. I wasn't just surviving, I was living again. And that, more than any court victory or professional achievement, was the greatest triumph of all. Several months had passed since the divorce, and life was finally starting to feel stable again. My days were filled with work and new hobbies, and the nights were no longer haunted by the memories of Candy. Therapy had done wonders, and I was learning to trust myself again. The anger I'd once felt toward her had dulled into a distant ache. Still there but manageable. I thought I had moved past it all, or at least far enough to start fresh. Then one evening, as I was settling into the couch with a book, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Candy. "Tim, can we talk? It's important." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep her locked firmly in the past where she belonged. But curiosity won out. "What's this about?" I typed back. Her reply was almost immediate. "In person, please. I really need to see you." Reluctantly, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop downtown the following day. When I arrived, I barely recognized her. Candy, who had always been so meticulous about her appearance, looked disheveled. Her hair hung limp around her face, and her eyes were rimmed with dark circles. "Tim," she said softly as I approached. "Candy," I replied, taking a seat across from her. "What's going on?" She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "I don't even know how to start," she said, her voice breaking. "Try," I said, keeping my tone even. She took a deep breath, tears welling in her eyes. "I made so many mistakes," she said. "I hurt you, I betrayed you, and now I'm paying the price." I said nothing, waiting for her to continue. I went to the doctor a few weeks ago, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I haven't been feeling well for a while. They ran some tests, and... She trailed off, looking down at the table as tears spilled onto her cheeks. And, I prompted, my stomach tightening. I'm HIV positive, she said, her words hitting like a sledgehammer. I sat back in my chair, stunned into silence. The weight of her confession hung heavy between us, filling the small space with a suffocating tension. Tim, she continued, her voice trembling. I don't even know how it happened. Jake, Ryan, I don't know who, but it doesn't matter. I'm scared, and I didn't know who else to turn to. I clenched my hands into fists under the table, anger and pity warring within me. Why are you telling me this, Candy? I asked finally. I needed to warn you, she said quickly. I got tested after we split, and I didn't want to risk, you know? Well, thanks for that, I said bitterly, though I couldn't ignore the small relief that washed over me. Her tears came faster now, and she reached across the table to grab my hand. I pulled away instinctively, and her face crumpled. Tim, I'm so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I ruined everything. I ruined us. I know I don't deserve it, but can you forgive me? Please. I stared at her, the woman I had once loved with all my heart, now a broken shell of herself. Her betrayal had shattered me, but seeing her like this, scared, vulnerable, desperate, it softened something in me. I forgive you, Candy, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm inside. Not for you, but for me. Carrying this anger, it's too heavy. But forgiveness doesn't mean I can forget what you did. She nodded, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I understand, she whispered. And it doesn't mean we can go back to the way things were, I added firmly. I've moved on. I'm building a new life, and there's no place for you in it. Not anymore. Her sobs grew louder, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty. But I reminded myself that this was the consequence of her choices, not mine. After a long silence, she wiped her face and stood. Thank you, Tim, she said, her voice barely audible, for hearing me out, and for forgiving me, even if I don't deserve it. I watched as she walked away, her once confident stride now hesitant and uncertain. When the door closed behind her, I let out a long breath, feeling the tension drain from my body. Forgiving Candy didn't erase the pain she had caused, but it gave me something else. Closure. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the past, free from her betrayal, and free to fully embrace the future I was working so hard to build. It had been a few weeks since my meeting with Candy. Life was returning to its new rhythm, though the encounter lingered in my mind. I had forgiven her, but the weight of everything we had been through, her betrayal, the secrets, the disease, still felt like a shadow following me. Then came the call that would change everything. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and I was sitting on the porch, flipping through a book, when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen to see an unknown number. Hello, I answered. Tim, this is Detective Harris with the local police department. The voice on the other end said, his tone grave. I need to inform you of a tragic incident involving Candy and her boss, Jake. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. What happened? There was a long pause before he continued. Earlier this morning, Jake committed an act of violence. He killed Candy, his son Ryan, and himself. We believe it was premeditated, but the investigation is still ongoing. The words didn't seem real. What? I whispered, my voice barely audible. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, the detective said. We're still piecing everything together, but it appears Jake had recently been diagnosed with HIV. He may have blamed Candy and Ryan for his condition, though we're looking into all possible motives. The rest of the conversation was a blur. I barely heard the details as the detective explained the sequence of events. A confrontation at Jake's home, a heated argument, and then the unspeakable. When the call ended, I sat there in stunned silence. My mind replayed the last time I'd seen Candy, her tearful apology and desperate plea for forgiveness. I had no idea that would be the last time I would ever see her alive. The following days passed in a haze. I couldn't stop thinking about the lives lost and the senselessness of it all. Candy, despite her mistakes, hadn't deserved this. Neither had Ryan. When Candy's parents called to tell me about the funeral, I didn't hesitate to offer my support. They were devastated, struggling to comprehend the tragedy that had taken their daughter. Despite everything, they had always been kind to me, and I felt it was the least I could do to be there for them now. The funeral was a somber affair, held on a rainy afternoon that mirrored the mood of the gathering. As I stood among the mourners, memories of my life with Candy flooded back. The good times, the laughter, the love we had once shared. Her parents were inconsolable, and I stayed close to them, offering what comfort I could. Her mother hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for being here, Tim," she said. "I know things weren't perfect between you two, but she always cared about you." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "She did?" I said softly, not sure if it was true but wanting to ease her pain. As the casket was lowered into the ground, I felt a strange mix of emotions: grief, anger, and a quiet sense of closure. Candy had made her choices, and they had led her down a dark path. But standing there, I realized I couldn't carry the burden of her mistakes anymore. It was time to let go. After the funeral, I stayed for a while, helping Candy's parents with the arrangements and sorting through her belongings. They were grateful for the help, and it felt like a final act of kindness for the woman I had once loved. When I finally returned home, I sat in the quiet of my living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. Candy, Jake, Ryan, they were all gone, their lives intertwined in ways I could never have imagined. The pain and betrayal they had brought into my life had been immense, but so had the lessons. I thought about the man I had become since Candy's betrayal, the strength I had found, the peace I was slowly rebuilding, and the future I was determined to create. I wasn't the same person I had been before, and for that I was grateful. As I poured myself a drink and raised it to the empty room, I whispered a quiet farewell to the past. It was time to move forward, leaving the ghosts behind and embracing the life that lay ahead. Life after the tragedy didn't return to normal. It simply became something else. There were mornings when the weight of it all, the betrayals, the losses, the echoes of what could have been, pressed so heavily on my chest that it felt impossible to breathe. But there were also mornings when the sun broke through the curtains just right, and I'd feel the faintest flicker of hope. Those mornings reminded me that healing wasn't a straight line but a series of small, hard-won victories. The first few weeks after the funeral were a blur. Candy's parents called often, seeking comfort in shared memories and thanking me for standing by them. It was bittersweet. For all the pain Candy had caused, I couldn't erase the image of the vibrant, passionate woman I'd once loved. I grieved for her, not as the person she had become but as the person she had been. Slowly, I began rebuilding. At first, it was simple things, reorganizing the house, throwing out old mementos that no longer felt meaningful. There was a strange catharsis in clearing away the clutter, like I was making room for a life that hadn't yet taken shape. Work became an anchor, something to occupy my mind and give me purpose. I buried myself in projects, taking on more responsibilities and even mentoring younger employees. It was easier than I expected. For all the chaos that had unraveled my personal life, I found a strange stability in the routine of the office. But it wasn't enough. One evening, a coworker named Rachel invited me to join a group of them for drinks after work. I hesitated at first. Socializing felt foreign, almost wrong, like I didn't deserve the kind of easy joy that came with laughing over a beer. But Rachel was persistent, and something in her warm smile convinced me to say yes. That night was the first time in months that I didn't feel like a shadow of myself. Sitting at the bar with Rachel and the others, swapping stories and joking about office mishaps, I caught glimpses of who I used to be. Rachel had a sharp wit and an infectious laugh, and she didn't shy away from pulling me into the conversation. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and I grew closer. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet, It was more like finding an old friend you didn't know you'd been missing. She had a way of asking the right questions without pushing too hard, giving me space to share when I was ready. "You know," she said one evening after work, her voice soft but steady, "it's okay to start over. Life isn't about pretending the bad things didn't happen. It's about finding what comes next." Her words stuck with me. I started going to the gym again, something I'd abandoned during the mess of the past year. The physical exertion felt good, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. I took up hiking, rediscovering a love for the outdoors I hadn't indulged in years. There was something deeply healing about standing on a mountaintop, looking out at the world and realizing how vast it was, and how small my problems seemed in comparison. But more than anything, I began letting people in. I'd always been guarded, even before Candy's betrayal, but now I made a conscious effort to open myself up. At work, at the gym, on those hiking trails, I started to see people not as potential threats to my fragile peace but as opportunities for connection. One afternoon, while hiking, I met a woman named Megan. She was sitting on a rock near the trail, adjusting her backpack, and we struck up a conversation. It was casual at first, comments about the weather, the difficulty of the trail, but as we walked together, something clicked. Megan was warm and genuine, with an easy smile and a love for nature that mirrored my own. We exchanged numbers, promising to hike together again. I didn't know if it would lead to anything more, but for the first time I wasn't afraid to find out. There were still hard days. The shadows of the past didn't disappear overnight, and there were moments when the memories crept in, unbidden and overwhelming. But each time I reminded myself of the progress I'd made. I wasn't the same man I'd been a year ago, or even 6 months ago. I was stronger now, more resilient, and for the first time in a long time, I believed in the possibility of a better future. As I stood on a mountaintop one crisp autumn morning, the wind tugging at my jacket and the sun warming my face, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't permanent, but it was enough. I didn't have all the answers yet, and maybe I never would. But I had something more important: a sense of purpose, a willingness to embrace the unknown, and a heart that was finally ready to heal.